In the early 14th century, Europe was a tightly wound system under strain. Population levels had reached historic highs after centuries of gradual growth. Most people lived close to subsistence, dependent on local harvests, predictable seasons, and fragile supply networks. Land was heavily cultivated, forests cleared, and margins for failure narrowed. The climate had begun to turn against this balance. A sequence of colder, wetter decades disrupted agriculture across much of Europe. Repeated harvest failures weakened bodies and shortened reserves. Malnutrition became common among rural laborers and urban poor alike. Disease was already present, but populations endured it as a constant background condition rather than an extraordinary threat. Cities had expanded rapidly, drawing people into dense, enclosed environments. Waste disposal was primitive. Clean water was inconsistent. Animals and humans lived in close proximity. Trade routes connected ports, markets, and inland towns in an increasingly integrated commercial network stretching from East Asia to the Mediterranean and beyond. Political authority was fragmented. Kingdoms, city-states, and feudal territories operated with limited coordination. The church provided moral structure and record-keeping, but offered little in the way of medical understanding. Illness was commonly explained through divine judgment, imbalance of humors, or corrupted air. By the 1340s, the world was more connected than ever before, yet less resilient than it appeared. Goods, people, and pathogens moved with growing speed across continents. When a new and highly lethal disease entered this system, there were few barriers capable of slowing it. The stage was set for a crisis that would test every institution, belief system, and social relationship of the medieval world. By the middle of the 14th century, stress fractures were already visible across medieval society. Repeated food shortages had eroded trust in traditional systems of protection. Local authorities struggled to stabilize prices or secure grain supplies. In many regions, hunger had become a recurring condition rather than an emergency. Ever wondered why pandemics have haunted humanity for centuries? It's not just bad luck. Think about it. Ancient trade routes, like the Silk Road, weren't just for silk and spices. They were superhighways for germs, connecting distant cities and spreading diseases like the plague faster than ever before. And then there's warfare. Armies on the move, living in crowded, unsanitary camps, were perfect breeding grounds for sickness. When soldiers returned home, they often brought an invisible, deadly enemy with them, devastating their own communities. For a long time, our understanding of medicine was limited. People blamed bad air or divine anger. But as science advanced, we started to understand germs, create vaccines, and develop public health systems. We've come a long way, but history reminds us how interconnected our world is, for better or for worse. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Religious life intensified under pressure. Signs, omens, and celestial events were widely interpreted as warnings. Processions, fasting, and public prayer increased, drawing large crowds into confined spaces. These gatherings, meant to seek divine favor, inadvertently amplified the spread of disease. Across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, societies were functioning, but only narrowly. Margins for survival had thinned. When reports began to circulate of a deadly sickness moving westward along trade routes, few understood its nature, and fewer still recognized the scale of what was approaching. The pressures had been building quietly. The collapse, when it came, would be sudden. The first reliable reports of the plague entering the Mediterranean world appeared in the late 1340s. Ports along the Black Sea and eastern Mediterranean began recording sudden outbreaks marked by fever, swelling, and rapid death. Infected communities collapsed within weeks. Survivors spoke of entire households disappearing almost overnight. As merchant vessels reached major ports such as Messina, Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, the disease followed. Authorities attempted to respond using familiar tools. Ships were turned away, crews isolated, and goods burned. These measures were unevenly enforced and poorly understood. In most cases, they came too late. The illness spread with extraordinary speed. Urban centers were struck first, but the countryside followed quickly. Roads, rivers, and market towns formed a web through which infection traveled outward from ports into interior regions. No social class was spared. Clergy, nobles, artisans, and laborers fell ill in large numbers. Traditional explanations failed to account for what was happening. Some blamed poisoned wells, foreign agents, or planetary alignment. Others interpreted the outbreak as divine punishment. Fear altered behavior. Families abandoned the sick. Physicians fled cities. Local governance broke down as officials either died or withdrew. Mortality rates exceeded anything recorded in living memory. In some towns, half the population died within a single season. Burial practices collapsed under the volume of corpses. Mass graves became common. Normal rhythms of work, worship, and trade ceased. Yet even as death spread, patterns began to emerge. Some areas suffered less severely than others. Certain individuals survived repeated exposure. These early shifts, barely noticed at the time, would later shape how societies rebuilt. For now, the medieval world was entering a period defined not by recovery, but by survival. As the plague advanced, individual responses gave way to systemic collapse. Entire administrative structures failed under the weight of mortality. Courts stopped functioning. Tax collection ceased. Records went unfinished as clerks and notaries died or fled. In Manitong's leadership passed abruptly to whoever remained alive and capable. Labor systems were among the first to break. Fields went unplanted. Workshops stood idle. Skilled workers disappeared faster than they could be replaced. In rural areas, livestock wandered untended. In cities, essential services such as food distribution and sanitation deteriorated rapidly. The church, central to medieval life, was deeply affected. Clergy faced higher exposure while administering last rites and caring for the sick. Parish after parish lost priests, monks, and nuns. Spiritual authority weakened as prayers appeared unanswered and holy spaces offered no protection. Medical responses became increasingly desperate. Remedies multiplied, but effectiveness did not. Public health actions were reactive rather than preventive. Some cities introduced rudimentary isolation policies, while others relied on expulsion of the sick. These measures varied widely and rarely halted transmission. Social order eroded. Fear disrupted family bonds and neighborly obligations. Property changed hands abruptly as inheritance systems struggled to process the scale of death. Legal norms bent or vanished entirely in the face of necessity. Despite the chaos, the plague followed its own internal logic. Waves of infection moved through regions, peaked and receded. Survivors emerged into emptied landscapes. The disease did not destroy society in a single moment, but forced it to operate under extreme conditions until its existing structures could no longer hold. At these days, the plague was no longer an event. It had become the dominant system shaping daily life. By the time the first wave of the Black Death began to subside, the scale of loss was unprecedented. Across Europe, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population had died within a few years. In some regions, mortality was even higher. Entire villages vanished from records, leaving only abandoned fields and collapsed dwellings. Urban centers suffered catastrophic declines. Cities that had taken centuries to grow lost decades of population in a matter of months. Trade volumes fell sharply. Tax bases collapsed. Governments faced sudden shortages of revenue alongside rising demands for stability and order. The impact extended far beyond Europe. The plague moved through the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Central and South Asia. Following commercial and military routes, major cities from Cairo to Damascus experienced repeated outbreaks. The disease reshaped interconnected societies across continents. Demographic imbalances followed. Young adults, often the most mobile and economically active, died in large numbers. Gender ratios shifted in some areas. Family lines ended abruptly. Orphan children and abandoned property became widespread features of the post-plague landscape. These losses were not evenly distributed. Wealth, geography, and timing influenced survival rates. Some rural areas recovered faster than cities. Certain households accumulated land and resources through inheritance and opportunity, while others disappeared entirely. The numbers were more than statistics. They represented a permanent alteration of human settlement patterns, labor availability, and economic expectations. Medieval society would not return to its previous form, because the population needed to sustain it no longer existed. Beyond the numbers, the Black Death reshaped everyday human experience in quieter, more enduring ways. Survivors lived in environments marked by absence. Familiar faces were gone. Entire neighborhoods stood partially empty. Social memory fractured as communities lost elders, craftsmen, and local leaders who had carried practical knowledge. Labor shortages altered personal relationships. Workers who remained found themselves in greater demand. In many regions, wages rose as landowners competed for hands to work their fields. This shift challenged long-standing hierarchies and expectations. Attempts by authorities to freeze wages or restrict movement often met resistance. Family structures changed. With high mortality among adults, households became smaller and more flexible. Women in some areas gained greater economic responsibility, managing property, businesses, and labor arrangements. These changes were uneven and often temporary, but they marked a departure from earlier norms. Psychological responses varied. Some communities turned inward, focusing on stability and continuity. Others embraced risk, consumption, and display. Religious devotion intensified for some, while skepticism and disengagement grew in others. The shared certainty of earlier belief systems weakened under the weight of mass death. Violence also surfaced in controlled but significant forms. Minority communities, particularly Jewish populations in parts of Europe, were scapegoated and attacked, accused of causing the plague through conspiracy or poisoning. These persecutions were localized but devastating, leaving long-term scars on regional histories. The human consequences of the plague were not defined by a single emotional response. They unfolded over years, shaping how people worked, believed, and related to one another in a world that had lost much of its familiar structure. As repeated outbreaks confirmed that the plague was not a single passing disaster, societies began to adapt. Practical responses replaced initial panic. Cities experimented with new forms of control, not fully understanding disease, but recognizing patterns of contagion and movement. Quarantine emerged gradually as a tool of governance. Ports such as Venice developed isolation periods for ships and travelers arriving from infected regions. Lazarettos were established on islands or at city edges to separate the sick from the healthy. These measures were imperfect, but they marked a shift toward organized public health. Economic adaptation followed demographic reality. Land was consolidated into fewer hands. Marginal farmland was abandoned, while more productive areas were intensified. Labor contracts became more flexible, and mobility increased as workers sought better conditions. Despite official resistance, these changes reshaped medieval economies from the ground up. Institutions adjusted unevenly. Some governments strengthened authority to manage crisis response, while others weakened under repeated strain. The Church attempted to reassert spiritual leadership, but its monopoly on explanation had been permanently altered. Alternative religious movements and localized practices gained ground. Medical thought also began to shift, slowly and without immediate breakthroughs. Observation gained greater importance. Records of symptoms, timing, and spread accumulated over generations. While cures remained elusive, the foundations of later public health thinking were laid during this period. Adaptation did not restore what had been lost. Instead, it produced a different equilibrium. Societies reorganized around reduced populations, altered expectations, and a growing awareness that large-scale disaster could return without warning. Over the decades that followed, the Black Death reshaped the deep structures of medieval society. Feudal relationships weakened as labor became scarce, and bargaining power shifted toward workers. Obligations that had once bound peasants to land and lord were increasingly contested or ignored in practice. Economic patterns changed permanently. Higher wages and greater mobility encouraged specialization and regional trade. Urban guilds adjusted to new realities, while some rural areas declined as population levels never fully recovered. Wealth became more concentrated in certain families and cities, altering political influence. Political authority evolved in response to crisis management. States that developed more centralized administration and taxation proved better equipped to respond to recurring outbreaks. Legal systems adapted to frequent inheritance disputes and labor conflicts, gradually standardizing procedures. Cultural expression reflected altered values. Art and literature engaged more directly with themes of mortality, transience, and uncertainty. The omnipresence of death reshaped how time, faith, and human effort were understood. These shifts did not represent despair alone, but a recalibration of priorities. Education and knowledge transmission were also affected. Losses among scholars and clergy disrupted continuity, but recovery encouraged reform. Universities expanded curricula, incorporating law, medicine, and natural philosophy more prominently. The groundwork was laid for later intellectual transformations. The Black Death did not create the modern world on its own, but it accelerated processes already underway. By removing constraints and exposing vulnerabilities, it altered the trajectory of European and interconnected societies for centuries to come. By the end of the 14th century, the Black Death had receded from immediate view, but it never fully disappeared. Plague returned in waves for generations, each outbreak echoing the original catastrophe with diminished force. Communities learned to recognize its arrival, even if they could not prevent it. The world that emerged was thinner, more cautious, and structurally different. Landscapes carried the marks of abandonment and reorganization. Institutions operated with the memory of failure built into their decisions. Survival itself had become a form of knowledge. What remained was not simply a record of death, but of adjustment. Societies endured by changing how they worked, governed, and explained uncertainty. The pandemic revealed limits, but also capacities for adaptation that reshaped historical trajectories. The Black Death passed into memory as a dividing line. Before it lay a world built on growth and assumption. After it stood a world shaped by loss, resilience, and long-term transformation. Its presence faded from daily life, but its consequences remained embedded in social structures, economic relationships, and collective awareness long after the disease itself moved on.